a terrifying story about Christmas night. Enjoy listening. Christmas Eve wasn't supposed to feel this empty. I'm 16, old enough to know that magic isn't real, but there's a difference between knowing it and feeling it. For the first time in years, there was no tree at our house. No lights, no music, just silence and a cold draft that whispered under the doorframes. It wasn't my parents' fault, really. Dad got called out of town on a last-minute job. A snowstorm had taken out half the power lines in the county, and he was working overtime to fix them. Mom was stuck at Aunt Linda's 2 towns over, snowed in after the storm rolled in harder than anyone predicted. And me? I was supposed to be with her. Supposed to be. I couldn't tell Mom why I stayed behind. Not really. I told her I'd watch the house, take care of the dog, and keep an eye on things, which sounded responsible enough. The truth was a lot dumber. I'd promised to hang out with some friends who bailed at the last second, and by then, Mom was already halfway to Aunt Linda's. Now it was just me, our golden retriever Daisy, and a fading fire in the hearth that didn't stand a chance against the kind of cold that crept into your bones. I tried to distract myself, but even the glow of my phone felt dim and hollow. Scrolling through my feed only made me feel worse. Photo after photo of happy families, presents piled high under their trees, and table spreads packed with food. My stomach growled as I stared at the frozen lasagna Mom left in the fridge. I decided I'd cook it later. That's when I heard it. A single knock at the front door. Not the kind of polite, 3-tap knock you'd expect from a neighbor or caroler. No, it was a deliberate, heavy thud that echoed through the quiet house. I froze. It was late, after 9 p.m., and the storm outside had only gotten worse. Who'd be out in weather like that? I told myself it had to be the wind or maybe a branch falling against the porch railing. But Daisy didn't agree. Her ears perked up, and she let out a low, warning growl as she stared at the door. I stood up, my heart thudding harder than I cared to admit, and moved toward the door. The closer I got, the colder the air felt. "Hello," I called out, my voice cracking slightly. No answer. I flipped the porch light switch. Nothing. The storm must have knocked out the power. Great. Grabbing my phone, I turned on the flashlight and pressed my eye to the peephole. No one was there. But as I pulled back, I noticed something through the frosted window pane. What looked like a trail of footprints leading from the driveway to the porch. Fresh ones. I stood there for what felt like forever, my breath fogging up the glass as I stared at the faint trail of footprints. They were deep, the kind made by boots, and they stopped right at the front steps. Probably a delivery guy, I muttered to myself, though I wasn't convinced. Who delivers packages in the middle of a blizzard this late? And why wouldn't they leave the package? Daisy whined softly, pawing at the door, her tail stiff and straight like a pointer. That wasn't normal for her. She was usually the kind of dog who wagged her tail at the mailman and barked at squirrels like they owed her money. I tried to shake off the unease twisting in my stomach. It was probably nothing. Maybe I'd just imagined the knock. Still, I grabbed the heaviest flashlight I could find from the drawer by the door, a solid metal one Dad used for camping trips, and cracked the door open just enough to peek outside. The wind whipped snow into my face, stinging my skin and making me squint against the glare of my phone's light. "Hello," I called again, louder this time, but my voice felt small against the howling wind. No answer. I glanced down at the footprints. They were definitely fresh. Whoever made them had walked straight up to the door, paused, and left. I stepped onto the porch, Daisy at my side, and swept the light across the yard. The driveway was buried under snow, and the road beyond it was barely visible. There were no cars, no sign of movement, nothing but the relentless flurry of white. Then I saw it. About 30 feet out, just past the driveway, stood a figure. It was hard to make out any details through the storm, but they were tall and still, too still. No shifting weight, no swaying against the wind. Just a motionless silhouette in the darkness. "Hey!" I shouted, gripping the flashlight tighter. "Do you need help?" No response. I took a step forward, and Daisy growled again, low and guttural. Her hackles were raised, her body tense, and it stopped me in my tracks. Daisy wasn't a guard dog by any stretch, but whatever she saw or smelled had her on edge. The figure shifted, tilting its head slightly as if curious. Then, slowly, it lifted an arm and waved. The wave wasn't friendly. It was slow, deliberate, and oddly stiff, like whoever or whatever didn't quite understand how to do it right. I took a step back, slamming the door shut with one hand and locking it with the other. My heart was racing now, every thump loud in my ears. Probably some weirdo, I muttered, trying to convince myself. Probably just someone trying to mess with me. But the truth was, I didn't believe that. Not really. I stood there for a moment, debating whether to call Mom or even the cops, when Daisy barked. A sharp, frantic sound that made me jump. She was still at the door, her nose pressed to the crack at the bottom, barking like her life depended on it. And then I heard it again. A knock. This time it came from the back door. The knock at the back door was softer than the first, but somehow it felt worse. Maybe it was the fact that someone, or something, had circled the house without me hearing a single crunch of snow. Or maybe it was because I knew for sure now that I wasn't alone. Daisy spun around and bolted toward the kitchen, barking her head off. The sound echoed in the empty house, and I followed her on instinct, the flashlight shaking slightly in my hand. The back door had a small window with a curtain Mom always kept closed. I hated that curtain now. It felt like a flimsy barrier between me and whoever was outside. Daisy, quiet, I hissed, though my voice was shaking too much to sound convincing. She didn't listen. Her barks turned to a low, throaty growl, her teeth bared as she stared at the door. I reached out slowly, pulling the curtain back just an inch, just enough to peek through. The figure was there, closer this time. It stood just outside the door, its head cocked to the side again in that same curious way. Now, with the porch light casting a faint glow, I could make out more details. The figure was wearing a long, heavy coat, dark and ragged at the edges, with a hood pulled low over its face. I couldn't see much of their features, just a pale sliver of skin and what looked like a grin. No, not a grin. Teeth. They were smiling, wide and too bright in the dark, and it wasn't the kind of smile that made you feel warm inside. It was wrong, like it didn't belong on a human face. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over Daisy, and grabbed my phone. My hands were trembling so badly I almost dropped it as I fumbled to unlock the screen and dial 911. But before I could press call, the figure moved. It didn't knock again. It didn't try the handle. It just stood there, staring, then raised a hand and pressed it against the glass. The hand was wrong. It looked human at first glance, but the fingers were too long. The nails cracked and blackened like charcoal. I couldn't stop staring as the hand slowly dragged down the glass, leaving faint streaks in its wake. Daisy barked again, snapping me out of my trance. "Get back!" I shouted, more to myself than to the figure. I forced my legs to move, darting forward and yanking the curtain shut again. I pressed my back to the wall, trying to steady my breathing. This wasn't normal. This wasn't some prank or a lost traveler. This was something else. The knocking started again, louder this time, and I realized with a sickening twist in my gut that it wasn't coming from the back door anymore. It was coming from the windows. The knocking at the windows wasn't random. It came in bursts, 3 slow knocks at one window, a pause, then another 3 at the next. The sound traveled around the house like a predator circling its prey, methodical and deliberate. Daisy was frantic now, barking and growling as she darted between the rooms, her claws scraping against the hardwood. I wanted to follow her, to grab her and hold on, but my feet felt like they were glued to the floor. Then came the scraping, a long, piercing screech of something sharp dragging across the glass. I turned toward the living room, the beam of my flashlight shaking as it cut through the dark. The curtain-covered window trembled, the scraping sound vibrating through the room like nails on a chalkboard. I couldn't stay here. Dropping the flashlight for just a second, I grabbed my phone again and hit 911. The ringing felt endless before a calm, automated voice shattered my last shred of hope. "We're sorry. All lines are currently busy. Please stay on the line." I ended the call. What was the point? Even if I reached someone, how would they get here in this weather? Think. I whispered to myself. Think, think. My eyes darted to the fireplace. There was an old poker leaning against the hearth, its iron tip blackened with soot. Grabbing it, I tested its weight in my hand. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. The scraping stopped, and for a moment the silence felt worse than the noise. Daisy whimpered behind me, her ears flat against her head as she stared at the hallway leading to the back of the house. Then I heard the creak of the back door. My stomach dropped. It wasn't loud, but in the quiet, it was deafening. I knew that sound. It was the noise the door made when you opened it slowly, the old hinges straining under the weight. I tightened my grip on the poker and moved toward the hallway, every step feeling heavier than the last. The light from my phone's flashlight bounced wildly as I rounded the corner. The back door was open. Snow swirled through the gap, a light dusting already settling on the floor. My mind raced. I knew I'd locked it. I was sure of it. But there it was, wide open, the curtain fluttering in the freezing wind. "Get out of here!" I yelled, my voice cracking. No response. I stepped closer, one hand gripping the poker, the other holding the flashlight in front of me. "I swear, I'll call the cops," I shouted, even though I knew how empty the threat was. Then I saw the footprints. They led from the open door into the house. The footprints weren't ordinary. They were large, almost too large for a person, with strange, jagged edges like claws had gouged into the melting snow. They led from the back door and disappeared into the hallway ahead, where the darkness swallowed the beam of my flashlight. I swallowed hard, gripping the poker tighter. Daisy was by my side now, her body low to the ground and trembling as she let out soft, nervous growls. I knelt down and whispered, "Stay," though I wasn't sure if I was telling her or myself. The house felt wrong. It wasn't just the cold creeping in through the open door. It was a heaviness in the air, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. Step by step, I followed the trail of footprints, my heart pounding louder with every step. They led to the basement door, which was slightly ajar. No way. That door was always locked. Dad kept it shut tight ever since we moved in, insisting the basement wasn't safe. The stairs were rickety, the ceiling leaked, and there were rumors the previous owner had issues. Mom called it a fixer-upper with personality, but Dad didn't mess around with it. Now the door was open. I stopped a few feet away, staring at the dark gap where the faint outlines of the footprints disappeared. My flashlight's beam barely penetrated the shadows beyond the door, and I could just make out the top of the narrow staircase leading down. Something was wrong with the stairs. They creaked. Not the kind of creak you'd expect from settling wood, but a rhythmic, deliberate sound. One step. Pause. Another step. Like something was moving down there. Daisy barked suddenly, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. Her bark was sharp, angry, and full of panic as she lunged toward the basement door. "No!" I grabbed her by the collar, pulling her back. She struggled, growling and barking at the dark void like she wanted to tear through it. "Stop it!" I hissed, my voice barely louder than the pounding of my heart. Then I heard it. A voice. It was faint, almost swallowed by the creaking stairs, but it was there. A low, guttural whisper rising from the basement. "Come down." I froze. My grip on Daisy's collar tightened as the words repeated, slow and deliberate. "Come down." It wasn't a request. It wasn't even a command. It was an invitation, dripping with malice. I did the only thing I could think of. I slammed the basement door shut and locked it. Daisy barked and growled at the door, her body tense and trembling, but I dragged her away, my pulse racing as I stumbled back toward the living room. I had to think. I had to figure out what to do. But as I rounded the corner, I stopped cold. The front door was wide open now, too. The front door stood open, its edges rimed with frost, letting in a howling gust that scattered snow across the living room floor. I stared at it, my mind racing in a loop of panic. I had locked that door. I was sure of it. "Daisy, come," I whispered, my voice hoarse and cracking. She hesitated, still fixated on the basement door, but eventually trotted to my side, her ears flat against her skull. "Good girl." I muttered, pulling her closer. She whimpered softly, pressing her head against my leg. I moved toward the front door, every step feeling heavier than the last. The wind pushed against me, cutting through my clothes and sending a shiver down my spine. The footprints were back. This time, they led from the threshold into the house. The jagged, claw-like imprints were stark against the wet snow and disappeared into the hallway where I'd just come from. My stomach twisted as I realized they were headed toward the basement door. I hesitated for a moment, then leaned out the door to shine my flashlight onto the front yard. The snowstorm was still raging, and the yard was empty. The figure I'd seen earlier was gone, but the strange trail of footprints was still there, circling the house like a predator stalking prey. The front door yanked itself out of my hand and slammed shut, the sound echoing through the house like a gunshot. Daisy barked and scrambled backward, her nails skittering on the floor. I spun around, my heart in my throat, but no one was there. The door was shut tight, and the wind outside was gone, replaced by a deafening silence. "Okay," I whispered to myself, gripping the poker tighter. "Okay, stay calm. Just stay calm." The silence didn't last. A knock. This time it wasn't coming from the doors or windows. It was coming from inside the house. Daisy growled again, her body stiff and trembling as she stared toward the hallway. The sound was soft at first, like someone gently rapping on a wall, but it grew louder and more insistent, moving through the house with an unnatural rhythm. I spun in place, my flashlight darting across the room, but I couldn't see anything. The sound wasn't coming from one spot. It was everywhere, reverberating through the walls and floor. Then it stopped. A deep, guttural laugh echoed from the hallway. It wasn't human. The laugh rattled me to my core, low and rasping like the sound of something choking on its own amusement. Came from the hallway, no, everywhere. It surrounded me, filling the house like it had seeped into the walls. Daisy barked frantically, lunging toward the dark hallway as though she was ready to fight whatever was there. I held her back, gripping her collar with one hand and the poker with the other. "No," I whispered, though my voice shook. "Stay with me." The laugh stopped abruptly, replaced by a suffocating silence. My flashlight flickered. "No, not now." I smacked the side of it, and the light flared back to life, cutting through the shadows. The hallway ahead was empty. The basement door was still shut, the lock glinting faintly in the beam of light. But the footprints, the jagged, clawed imprints, were everywhere now. They covered the floor, weaving and overlapping like something had been pacing. And then I heard it. The creak of a floorboard came from behind me. I spun around so fast I nearly dropped the flashlight. The beam of light swept across the living room, the kitchen, the doorways, but nothing moved. The room was still, but the air felt heavy, oppressive, like something was watching me. "Show yourself," I shouted, my voice cracking. The laugh returned, louder this time. I swung the flashlight wildly, the beam catching the edges of the furniture, the glint of the frost-covered windows. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. Daisy's growls grew more frantic, her body trembling against my leg. And then I saw it. The figure was standing in the far corner of the living room, half hidden in shadow. It was tall, impossibly tall, its head nearly brushing the ceiling. The long coat I'd seen earlier wasn't a coat at all. It was something darker, something alive, shifting and writhing as though made of shadow itself. Its face, God, its face. The grin was still there, wide and unnatural, stretching too far across its pale, featureless head. The teeth gleamed in the light, sharp and jagged like shards of broken glass. It tilted its head again, studying me with an almost childlike curiosity, then raised one long, clawed hand and pointed. Not at me, at the basement door. "No," I whispered, shaking my head as if denying it would make it less real. My back pressed against the wall, the cold from the frost-covered windows biting through my clothes. Daisy was barking so fiercely now that she sounded hoarse, but she didn't lunge forward. She stayed rooted to my side, her body trembling with fear. The thing didn't move. It just stood there, impossibly still, its grin stretching wider until I thought its jaw might unhinge. The pointing claw stayed fixed on the basement door. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to, but my eyes were drawn to it anyway. The lock on the basement door was turning. I heard the faint metallic click as it unlatched, saw the handle twist slowly, deliberately, as though someone or something on the other side was taking its time. "No, no, no," I stammered, my breath fogging in the freezing air. I gripped the poker tighter, raising it in front of me like it could actually stop whatever was coming. The door swung open. The darkness beyond the doorway was absolute, so thick it seemed to swallow the beam of my flashlight. The stairs creaked again, that slow, deliberate rhythm of something moving upward. I wanted to run. My instincts screamed at me to grab Daisy, bolt out the front door, and never look back. But my legs wouldn't move. I was frozen, rooted to the spot as a figure began to emerge from the basement. At first, all I saw was a pale hand gripping the edge of the doorframe. Like the other figure, it wasn't quite right. The fingers were too long, the nails blackened and cracked. Then came the rest of it. The figure crawled out on all fours, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a marionette controlled by clumsy strings. It was thin, emaciated. Its skin stretched tight over bones that jutted out at odd angles. Its head lolled to one side, the same unnatural grin splitting its face. Behind it, the darkness seemed to writhe and shift, as though alive. "Stay back," I shouted, my voice breaking. I swung the poker in front of me, the metal whistling through the air. The creature didn't flinch. It didn't even seem to notice. It crawled forward, its head tilting back as if sniffing the air. The first figure, the tall one, hadn't moved. It still stood in the corner, watching, its grin as wide and unsettling as ever. And then, in unison, both figures spoke. "Come down." The words sent a chill through me, colder than the wind outside, colder than anything I'd ever felt. They didn't sound like voices. They were echoes, layered and distorted, as though coming from the walls themselves. Daisy snapped me out of it. She lunged forward, barking wildly, and the crawling figure froze. It tilted its head toward her, almost curious, then let out a shrill, ear-piercing screech that made my vision blur and my knees buckle. I yanked Daisy back, stumbling as I tried to retreat. My flashlight flickered again, and for a split second, the beam caught something behind the crawling figure, more movement. Shapes, dozens of them, writhing and shifting in the darkness of the basement. They were coming. The writhing shapes in the basement were getting closer, their twisted, jerky movements barely visible in the flickering beam of my flashlight. My chest tightened as the crawling figure pulled itself fully into the hallway, its grin growing impossibly wider as it started to rise. I stumbled backward, dragging Daisy with me. Her barking turned into frantic yelps as she pulled against my grip, her instincts screaming the same thing mine were: run. The tall figure in the corner didn't move. It just kept pointing at the basement door, as if mocking me, its shadowy form blending into the dark. I didn't have a plan, just the overwhelming need to get out. My mind raced, every sound amplified. Daisy's whimpers, the creaking floorboards, the guttural scraping of the crawling figure's nails against the wood. "Come down!" The voices echoed again, louder this time, almost a command. "No!" I shouted, swinging the poker in front of me like it could somehow hold them back. The crawling figure flinched, just for a moment, but it was enough. I turned and bolted toward the living room. The front door, my way out, was closed again. I didn't care. I dropped the flashlight and threw myself at the door, fumbling with the locks as Daisy barked at my feet. My hands were shaking so badly it felt like the deadbolt took hours to undo. But finally, I wrenched the door open. Cold air blasted in, cutting through the heat of my panic. I didn't stop to look behind me. I didn't want to see how close they were. I just ran, Daisy at my heels, into the storm. The snow was deep, almost up to my knees, and every step was a struggle. The wind howled, tearing at my face, but I pushed forward, following the faint glow of the streetlights barely visible through the whiteout. Behind me, the house groaned. It wasn't just the wind. It was a deep, resonant sound, like the building itself was alive. I glanced over my shoulder and felt my stomach drop. They were at the doorway. The tall figure stood in the threshold, its shadow stretching unnaturally far across the snow. The crawling figure crouched beside it, its head tilted in that same unnatural way. And behind them, spilling out of the open basement door, came more shapes. Pale, twisted forms writhing and clawing their way into the house, filling the doorway like a tide of shadows. I didn't stop running. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I kept going, the sounds of the storm and Daisy's frantic barking pushing me forward. Finally, I saw it, the neighbor's house. Their porch light was on, a faint beacon in the storm. I stumbled up their driveway, pounding on the door with what little strength I had left. "Help!" I shouted, my voice hoarse. "Please, let me in." The door opened, and Mrs. Carpenter stood there, her face pale and worried. "What on earth?" she started, but I didn't let her finish. "They're in my house," I gasped, pulling Daisy inside. "Something's in my house." She stared at me, confused and alarmed. "What are you talking about? Who's in your house?" I turned to point, but through the swirling snow, the house was gone. The house that I had spent my whole life in was no longer there. The spot where it should have been was nothing but an empty lot, blanketed in untouched snow. I blinked, convinced the storm was playing tricks on me, but no amount of blinking brought it back. "No," I whispered, my breath fogging in the freezing air. It was right there. You saw it, didn't you?" Mrs. Carpenter shook her head slowly, her eyes narrowing. "Your house? What are you talking about? That lot's been empty since we moved in 5 years ago." "That's not true," I shouted, my voice cracking. "I live there. My parents live there." Behind me, Daisy whined, her tail tucked between her legs as she pressed against my side. Mrs. Carpenter hesitated, looking at me like I'd lost my mind. "Listen, honey, maybe you've got the wrong place. You're freezing. Come inside and sit down. We'll figure this out." I wanted to argue, to scream at her that I wasn't crazy, but my legs buckled beneath me, and the warmth of her house was too tempting to resist. She guided me inside, shutting the door against the storm, and wrapped a blanket around my shoulders. "Stay here," she said softly. "I'll call someone. Your mom, maybe." She left me sitting on her couch, Daisy pressed against my side. My hands were still trembling, the poker I'd been gripping forgotten somewhere outside. Every sound, the ticking clock, the hum of the heater, felt too loud, too normal, as if the last hour hadn't happened. But it had. I knew it had. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and I nearly dropped it as I scrambled to pull it out. The screen showed a notification. One missed call from Mom. Relief washed over me as I hit redial, clutching the phone to my ear. It rang once, twice, then, "Hello." Mom's voice, clear and steady. "Mom," I gasped, tears stinging my eyes. "Something's happened. The house. It's gone. I don't know where you are, but please, come get me." There was a pause, long enough to make my stomach twist. "Honey," Mom said finally, her voice slow and careful. "What are you talking about? I'm at home. Where are you?" My blood ran cold. "No, you're not," I whispered. "I'm looking at it, Mom. It's not there. It's just gone." "Stop joking," she said, a nervous laugh creeping into her tone. "Your father and I are here right now. We just got back." Her voice cut off abruptly, replaced by a low, static hum. "Mom," I said, panic rising. "Mom, are you there?" The static deepened, and through the crackling, I heard it again. "Come down." I dropped the phone. Mrs. Carpenter rushed back into the room at the sound of my scream, her face pale with worry. "What is it? What's wrong?" I couldn't answer. I couldn't say anything. All I could do was stare at the window, where a fresh set of footprints, jagged, clawed, and impossibly large, led from the empty lot to the edge of her porch.